With only a few hours to go before Americans cast their ballots, South Africa is currently the United States' 38th largest goods trading partner, with about $14 billion in total. U.S. goods and services trade with South Africa totaled an estimated 18.9 billion rand in 2018. Let's take a further look at the U.S. elections and perhaps a little bit later on how that outcome will impact trade relations with South Africa. I'm joined via Zoom by political economist Daniel Silke. Daniel, thanks so much for your time on SABC News this afternoon. Now, even before the results are out, questions about the legitimacy of those results, often coming from the incumbent, are surfacing.
Yes, good afternoon. Yes, I think this election takes place in a heightened atmosphere of tension in the United States. We've very rarely seen before the legitimacy of the process being questioned well in advance of that process taking place. And I think that one of the dangers, of course, for the United States is that there is a contestation, a legal contestation on some of the results in the course of the next few days. This will leave the United States in a degree of leadership limbo, I suppose, until that matter is resolved. And I think it all depends, of course, as to whether there is a clearly projected winner tomorrow night or into the early hours of Wednesday, or whether the vote remains incredibly close, as it might well do.
When it comes to who may win that election, polls seem to be consistently putting Joe Biden ahead of Donald Trump, even in battleground states. But there's also a caution about believing what the polls say after that 2016 upset where Donald Trump won that election.
Yes, I think we've all become a little bit more cautious about using polls to predict elections. The only difference one can perhaps make is that at the same time in 2016 as now, just before the election, Hillary Clinton had a much lower approval rating, and also her overall favorability rating was substantially less. It was only 3 or 4 points ahead of Donald Trump then, whereas Joe Biden today is about 9 or 10 points ahead. So there is some sort of leaning towards Biden approach from the polls. But you're right, it's the key battleground states that are critical. And there the polls are very tight and in fact have been tightening over the course of the last few days.
Coronavirus seems to be dominating the headlines across the world, especially in the US context with those high number of infections and the high number of deaths. How much of a role do you believe that's going to play in how Americans across the political spectrum end up voting?
Well, I certainly think that when you're in the midst of a pandemic, the pandemic perhaps will be the big winner in this election, because I think Americans are going to vote not just on the issue of how the pandemic has been dealt with from a healthcare point of view, but they're also going to vote on the effects of the pandemic on the economy. You must remember that prior to the onset of COVID, the US economy was looking relatively healthy, job creation looking relatively healthy, those GDP figures coming out of the US looking pretty good. And of course, as a result of COVID, we've seen a marked decline in just about every single economic indicator, albeit with some recovery now more recently. So I think that for Americans, it's going to be a mixed bag of questioning the public health reaction to COVID and, of course, just how the authorities have dealt with the economic fallout.
Daniel, how are the markets reacting in the days to that US election, and what are they perhaps thinking about either candidate winning?
Look, I think we've seen markets relatively stable given the propensity towards volatility that all of this creates. Markets have been volatile on the basis of the second wave of cases now appearing in the US and, of course, in Western Europe as well. But it's certainly possible that if we have a disputed election, we will see a fairly volatile markets for the next few days or perhaps even weeks until the courts decide if that is to be the case. But ultimately, I think the historical proof when looking at markets show that it doesn't really matter who wins. From a both Democrat and Republican point of view, markets in the end come out relatively stable, although there might well be certain sectors that are going to benefit from a Biden presidency when compared to certain sectors that have benefited from a Trump presidency.
All right, and in a South African context, watching that election, the South African government and South African people would perhaps want to know who is going to win. Can we predict what kind of policies, whether it's trade, diplomatic relations, and more could come out of either candidate?
Yeah, look, I think that, the Democrats are probably more likely to have more of a, what I call expansive foreign policy, which will be centered around trade, the creation of economic opportunity. I think the Republicans have perhaps shied away from that, replacing trade with security interests. And their interests in Africa over the course of the last few years really have been on the security front more than on the trade front. So I do think that, South Africans can perhaps say, on average, that a Biden presidency might well be a little bit more beneficial on the trade front. But we've seen in the past as well that past Republican presidents have actually had a fairly favorable relationship with Africa, encouraging all sorts of deals, including, I might add, issues surrounding food, agribusiness, and energy supply as well. So, I think it's a toss-up between the two, but the Trump administration really hasn't been that engaged in Africa over the last 4 years.
We'll see what happens with that AGOA and more as the election results start to trickle in over the next week or so. Daniel Silke, political economist, thanks so much for your time on SABC News this afternoon. It's time to take a short